Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I hope that everyone had a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Here in the Midwest, we got zapped with some frigid weather over Christmas. It got down to -10 air temperature, not wind chill, air temperature here in Indianapolis. Of course, there was a terrible, unbelievable blizzard in Buffalo. So I hope you all made it through all of that and stayed safe. Today actually is New Year's Day holiday off work in the United States because New Year's Day fell out of Sunday, so that which we celebrated on the Monday. And yet here I am giving a podcast of what's going on. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when you work for yourself or semi-independently, you really end up with a different relationship to work than when you work for a big corporation. I work in this co-working facility near my house, and there's several people in here today. When I got in, somebody had already made a pot of coffee, and it's just a great vibe to be around people who are focused and on mission and really enthusiastic about what they're doing, who aren't just putting in the minimum at the corporation, which people are more and more doing these days. And so I wanted to be in the office today. And then also I am going to be moving house. So I'm not moving long distance, just within the region, but that's going to be happening in the near future. And so that's going to be a bit disruptive to me on the schedule. So I want to make sure I can make up the hours, as it were, when I can. And yes, that is going to affect my podcast, because I'm going to have to relocate my studio. And so that's probably going to have me out of commission for a little bit. The podcast is going to go on, that's for sure. I'm not going to put it on hiatus or anything like that, but I might end up not having a camera, or the audio quality might be a little off. We'll see, but I'm going to be working on that. But, I am moving here within the region. In the month of January, my podcast and site are going to be sponsored by American Reformer. American Reformer is the nonprofit that I co-founded, where I'm a senior fellow, that is focused on helping the Protestant church to successfully adapt to the 21st century in what I have called the negative world, and to help reinvigorate Protestantism in American cultural and political life. So that's a big agenda, and we're working hard on it. I hope that you will check us out at AmericanReformer.org. We have a great journal there, edited by Ben Dunson, with all kinds of excellent content. Check that out. Subscribe to our mailing list. And we do more than that, too. We also work with stakeholders in various organizations to help them navigate these transitions, or help them address situations where there's mission drift in an institution. But be sure to check out the website and the journal. So it's AmericanReformer.org. Since it's the beginning of the year, it's the logical time for people to actually either be looking backwards at what they accomplished over the past year, or to be looking forward for 2023. And so what I wanted to do today was just to look forward a bit at 2023. What's going to happen? And again, the key theme here, and the key thing to keep in mind, is that we cannot predict the future. That's obvious, I know, but too often we don't live that way. Again, I have been influenced by the work of Nassim Taleb and his idea that randomness and black swan events play an enormous role in shaping our society and our futures. Think again about just 2022. Who predicted Ukraine invasion? Who predicted the highest inflation and interest rates jacked up in a long time? It's been 40 years since we've had inflation this high. Who was going to predict COVID? Who was going to predict Donald Trump? All of these major disruptive events occurred, and not only did we not predict them, we didn't even know that they could occur, a lot of them. Now, maybe the Ukraine invasion, there was some warning on that, but I don't think anybody started year 2023 thinking, wow, there's going to be a big inflation outbreak this year. But there was. And so we just need to be aware that things are going to happen in 2023 that we can't predict and that we don't see coming. The unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld used to put it. And so when we live in this world of uncertainty, when we live in this world of black swan events, we should be consciously thinking about how we structure our lives to be resilient or even anti-fragile in the face of some of these unknown events, whether they're good events or bad events. We want to think about that. So what's going to happen in 2023 that we're not even thinking about? And that's one of the things that I think we should talk about. But I want to highlight a theme that I think is going to be unpopular with a lot of people, and there may even be some disagreement about, but that's okay, because I'm not here to tell people what they want to hear. I'm here to give people my honest perspectives and points of view. And clearly, I am no more authoritatively qualified to predict the future than anyone else. So by all means, get inputs from other people, perspectives from other people. But I will give you one thing that I think we ought to be thinking about, and that is the theme of the return to normal. This is a theme that sort of arose in 2022. We could sort of see it coming with the abrupt lifting of all the pandemic measures in the wake of the Ukraine invasion. But I believe that there is a big hunger on the part of the American people as a whole for some sort of return to normal. Now, things are not normal. They're not normal by any means. We still have shortages of things. Now, maybe we always had these kinds of shortages and we just never really paid attention to them and we're attuned to shortages now. But for example, there's been shortages of children's Tylenol and children's medicines. Our son got sick, and fortunately, we were able to get the medicine we needed. But I mean, the shelves were completely stripped bare since November on this stuff. So, children's medicine shortages, periodically, there's just shortages. What's going on there? And of course, inflation is still high, although seems to have come down a little bit. Interest rates are up. The housing market, who knows what's going to happen with that? So this idea that things are normal is simply not true. But things are more normal than they were, say, 2 years ago. And people want things to be normal. There is a desire for normal. And when I say people, I'm talking about not necessarily you and me type people, although, we might, not the people who are, reading the newspaper and deeply informed on Twitter, debating the issues of the day. I'm talking about the normie, the person who, they used to do little segments on TV where they would show up and put the microphone in their face and say, who's the president of the United States? And they don't know, right? You always see these things like, the average person in America doesn't know even basic facts around the country. You can't name one Supreme Court justice. That's the average person in America. The average person who just wants to grill burgers and brats in their backyard. They just want to watch the sports ball. These people are hungry for normal. They are not looking for more and more continuation of the same. Whereas I think some of the political active people like the idea of crisis, like the idea of things escalating, because there's a belief that this could potentially lead to an outcome that they might like. I think there's some of this on the left, there's some of this on the right, but I think the average person is not at all interested in it. And so, for example, everybody basically wants to forget about COVID, in my opinion. You'll essentially occasionally see these things on Twitter. This place in California is now recommending masks, but people are not paying attention to that anymore. People are not paying attention to the calls from the CDC to get your 10th booster shot, for the latest variant. People have moved on from COVID. They're not interested in thinking about COVID. And so they're not going to listen, when people try to shut things down. And by the way, our leadership now basically realizes that they massively overreacted and caused enormous problems in education and other things for downtowns. And they're not going to do that again, most likely. Not anytime soon over the same thing, at any rate. And so I think that, people have moved on. And so I think that's good. Now, the flip side of that is people are really not interested in relitigating the past over COVID either. For one thing, most people in our societies were implicated in COVID at some level, in the COVID response. 80% of people, I believe, got at least one COVID vaccine shot. Every single leader in America basically was in on the lockdowns. There were very few like Ron DeSantis, who, courageously defied that and was proven right. But, here in Indianapolis, there was not a single civic leader who was pushing back on any of these measures. So it's not likely that anybody's going to be interested in any self-reflection. I think we're going to treat this as, what was that phrase they used? Mass formation psychosis, or it's like a moral panic. It's one of these things like, the Satanism panic in preschools from, the 1980s, or probably the Salem witch trials, all of them. Society gets caught up in something, and a couple years later, they're like, oh, wow, we shouldn't have done that. And so there's sort of a collective amnesia, and people just agree to sweep it under the rug. They don't want to think about it because they'd have to think about their own role in it. And they just don't want to do that. And people don't want to relive COVID. They want to move on from COVID. And so I think there's going to be less desire to relitigate the past on COVID. And so I think this is one theme I'm going to just recur to on a couple things here is I think relitigating the past is going to be unpopular. We also saw that in the election, in the 2020 election. The candidates who really were all in on 2020 election relitigation, talking about, stolen elections, whatever, they didn't win. They didn't do well. And the sort of hard MAGA candidates dramatically underperformed or even lost. And again, people like to talk about, ballot harvesting, mail-in ballots, but quite apart from all of that, you can just see that these people massively underperformed relative to what they should have done. And so we see that the same hits that worked in 2016 and worked to some extent in 2020, they don't work anymore. And so that's one reason I think the implication here is that the Trump movement, Trump is going to have trouble reigniting the flame because Trump represents abnormal politics. People want normal. People are tired of this sort of like fever pitch. It's hard to sustain this sort of fever pitch for a very long time. And what we see historically is that populism basically always fades out. I have really focused over the last couple years in looking at the parallels between Trump populist movement and the early 90s populist movement. The truth is, early 90s populism, what you can think of Ross Perot or Pat Buchanan, things of that nature, there was a movement that was nearly identical to today's movement. Now, it had less success. They did not successfully capture the presidency, for example. But all of the literature of that era is remarkably identical to what's being done today. In fact, most of it's better and written by people who are clearly smarter than the people writing today. And I might write an article about this at some point. I have not fully completed digesting all of the works that I want to digest from that era to try to learn the lessons. But in the February session of our Conditions of Modernity course for members, we're going to be sampling some of that literature. Obviously, there's a limit to what we can cover in one Zoom. It's basically a survey course, and I'm giving people, essentially the syllabus of I'll give people all the early 90s literature that's on my list, and you can go back and read as much of it as you like. But we'll sample it, and we'll talk about what was going on and what was the themes, because it's really important that we don't fall into the trap of thinking there's something new here. It's like I always like to say, there's nothing older than the New Right. If you go back to the New Right movement of the 1970s and early 1980s, again, rhetorically, some of it's almost identical to today. We're not interested in conserving anything. We're interested in, revolutionary overthrow of the system. It's exactly the same. Remember Ecclesiastes. There is nothing new under the sun. That's reality. There's nothing new under the sun on some of the stuff. And so, we need to understand the historical parallels and what has happened. And what we saw in the early 90s is that populist movement fizzled out. It was pretty strong in 92. By 96, it was dramatically weakened. And then by the end of the decade, it had completely faded away. To be honest, I don't know why it did that. But, it did. And so I think we look at it. This is kind of what happens. These sort of insurgencies always sort of fizzle out. And so I think something similar is going to happen here. To be quite honest, I think we're going to look at something of a fizzling out of populism. And fundamental change in society, fundamental restructuring of society can occur, in part through populist discontent, but it typically has to involve some sort of major crisis of legitimacy of the system or a major external threat to the system. So if you go back to the Great Depression, it was a crisis of legitimacy for the laissez-faire capitalist system. And whether you agree with the New Deal or don't agree with the New Deal was in part possible because the old system wasn't working anymore. World War II was an existential conflict, right? The Cold War was an existential conflict. So until we have that sort of existential conflict or that kind of crisis of legitimacy, I don't think that we're going to see this like mass change to the system that we need. Now, it is true that a significant share of our society is in very bad shape. I'd say the bottom 25% of our society, in terms of income and education, things of that nature, are just in terrible shape. There's been some new research that's just been published. I've been looking at it on Twitter, some of the papers that show that much of the early deaths, the deaths of despair, the things that have been driving the declines in life expectancy are very concentrated in the bottom 10% of income. And so we do have essentially a significant share, I'd say it's probably a quarter of our population that is in very bad shape, in tremendous distress, but they are people who have sort of been, they're like a defeated enemy, right? They're people who have been totally shellacked by the system. They have been degraded in a lot of ways. Society degraded them with the drugs, the opioids, for example, is degrading them with gambling, degrading them with the payday loan store, all these vices, they're overweight, all these things that, there's probably some, responsibility people have to take for themselves, but there's also, the things that the system has actively promoted. Previously we did not have, when I was growing up, we did not have all these opioids. We did not have fentanyl. So, you could smoke very low potency weed, or you could get drunk, and a lot of people had problems with alcoholism or drunk driving, but you didn't have the things that you have today that are just much, much bigger deal. And so the conditions of this bottom 25% do not really permit them to very easily fight back against the system, particularly in the face of a completely united elite that simply doesn't care about them. And in many respects, to the extent that that bottom 25% is white, many of the elites actively despise and hate them and kind of wish they would die and go away. That's just the simple truth. And so I don't know that that's really going to cause a problem per se yet. So could happen. I think we could have this crisis of legitimacy. I do see, signs of it. But, again, I've been seeing signs for a long time. Going back to the 80s, everybody's talking about the debt. My whole life, Republicans have been talking about the debt and the deficit. What are we up to now? $28 trillion in debt. And again, maybe these interest rates, this inflation will cause the financial crisis that I've been hearing about my whole life. But if you'd gone back to 1990 and told people that we were going to have $28 trillion in debt, they would have said society's already collapsed, hyperinflation, it would be over. The reality is, objectively speaking, many of the things that conservatives have been telling us for a long time were objectively not true. We can see it empirically. That's not to say that debt doesn't matter and that you won't eventually be sunk by debt. But conservatives have been dramatically inflating, as it were, the negative consequences of high levels of government debt. Certainly less impactful within the range. So there's a little bit of a boy who cries wolf on this, I think, for a lot of things. We would have been said we were toast, right? Well, we didn't be toast. And so you can go on down the line and look at all these things that are happening and say, wow, they're going to take the system out. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. As Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in the nation. And again, I think there are big long-term issues in our society. Trust is draining out of the system, justly so. Right? There's declining trust in our institutions because they're not performing well. Again, I keep going back to the electricity example where, having a generator at your house, at a minimum having a portable generator, or even installing sophisticated backup power for residences is now becoming quasi-normal. The number of houses with backup power systems has increased enormously. It's like up 10x in the last decade or so. Pizza parlors are now installing backup generators. When you can't rely on the power, that's telling you something. When people are investing tons of money into what essentially in a functional society would be a deadweight loss, it's a expensive backup power system. That tells you something. I was just reading an article in the paper about this latest Southwest Airlines fiasco. It may have been the Wall Street Journal, and they were saying, well, now you need to have a backup plan when you're traveling. You need to have money, reserves, credit line, so that if necessary, you can just buy yourself another plane ticket or buy yourself a car. You can't just get on a plane anymore and assume you're going to get there. Now, that may be a little overstated, but this idea that you have to be thinking about expensive backup and contingency plans when you catch a flight to New York, again, that's like third world. So we're seeing dramatically reduced functionality in our society, and at some point, it will cause a problem. Now, as they say in the finance world, the market can stay irrational a lot longer than you can stay solvent. So, who knows how long it'll take? But I do believe this is bad. But I also think some of the kind of dissident right critiques are clearly not true when it comes to the capacity of society. Yes, it's true. We can't build a train. We try to build a high-speed rail in California. It's vaporware. It's a complete debacle. You look at all the things we can't do, all the incompetence and the corruption, et cetera. We think that, we've lost something, right? That we're no longer capable of doing things. Well, I see indications that we actually are capable of doing things. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal about this new liquefied natural gas terminal in Germany that some company has built in just a few months. And basically the idea was normally it would take 5 years or some years and years and years to build a new liquefied natural gas terminal. They said, we got to get off Russian gas. We need to be able to import more gas. What do we got to do to build this terminal? And in a few months, basically they built a new liquefied natural gas terminal. We saw the same thing happen when that bridge, I-35 West, collapsed in Minneapolis. Big bridge over the Mississippi River. Now, Mississippi's not as wide there as it is at other places. This isn't like building a bridge across the river at St. Louis. Nevertheless, major bridge, rebuilt in 14 months. Boom, we did it. Built a better bridge than was there before in 14 months. Or take a look at what Elon Musk has accomplished with SpaceX, with Starlink, with Tesla. Again, he hasn't always hit his timelines. It hasn't always been as great as he said. This is big, audacious, technical advance that he's been able to do. And so we actually have the underlying capacity to do things. What we don't have is the will. And we may never have the will to say, no, we're not going to allow all this DEI and we're not going to allow all this red tape to stop us from doing the things that we want to do anymore. We may never be able to muster the will to do that, but in sort of urgent exception conditions or in sorts of zones of exception that people like Elon Musk have been able to create, we have not lost the technical capacity or the organizational capacity to actually be able to do things. And so, in a sense, you would say, well, that's good for society. But this idea that we're sort of going to suffer like a Roman decline, where we just have this degraded scenario, inevitably because we've lost the technical and organizational competence, I don't know that that's inevitable. Now, it may actually happen. Again, it's heading that direction as more and more of our systems degrade. And maybe as the baby boomers retire and take a lot of their expertise with them, a lot of this will happen. But, when something really is like an urgent emergency, we seem to be able to pull it off still. So, I'd be careful about that. So, again, I think that we still don't have the crisis of legitimacy. People are hungry to go back to normal. They're going to overlook some of this stuff. You cannot, again, the key is you cannot sustain a fever pitch forever. Even go back to the campus unrest of the late 60s, early 70s. It may have been 1970 that this happened, but there'd been massive, 70, 71, massive protests, people getting killed on campus. In the fall, people are thinking it's going to be even worse next year. People came back to campus. It was over. It basically over. It just disappeared. And a lot of people like to say, well, there's some, oligarchs or something, the regime is pulling all the strings. And definitely there are people in the system that have an influence. That was clearly a decision to turn off the COVID stuff, for example. But sometimes things just happen. And moral panics, mass formation, psychosis or whatever, it just dissipates. And so I see, starting in 22, there's been some dissipation with this. So, unless additional crises like major economic distress, major depression, some kind of major currency or financial crisis, some sort of crisis that the system can't solve comes and causes a crisis of legitimacy, I think people are going to cling to normal because they're ready to go back. And so I might think about how we can align ourselves with normal and maybe lean into that a little bit going forward. And again, this isn't necessarily popular with conservatives. And I say that because the reality is if you're a very conservative person, especially if you're a religiously conservative person, normal, meaning sort of maybe the status quo ante of Trump, let's think about that, normal, is not the society you would prefer, right? It's the negative world. Normal is, in some extent, what I've called the negative world, where society has essentially rejected the values that you hold to. And it's moving forward. And again, this is kind of a conservative trope. Well, the market will eventually discipline this. Get woke, go broke, people might say. Or, you'll go broke. You'll go bankrupt if you spend too much on your deficits. Or, Western society was built on Christianity and it can't function. It won't be able to function without Christianity. And the insanity will eventually cause, the universe to react and do something. And that will eventually happen, but it might last a very long time. I mean, Rome was a very advanced, high-functioning society based on a non-Christian, pagan moral system. That's what it was. And yes, it eventually collapsed, as kind of all human systems do, but it went on a very, very long time. The Soviet Union went on a long time. This idea, it's kind of a cope, this idea that, reality or some sort of external force will simply impose discipline on people and things that we don't like. It's not necessarily going to do that. Secondly, it also sort of makes you think you don't actually have to do anything. I'll just sit back and kind of chuckle at what they're doing because eventually Illinois is going to collapse because they have so much debt. Well, I don't know that's going to happen. If you want change, you kind of got to make it happen yourself. And one reason that the left has been more successful than the right at getting change is because they're much more motivated to actually do something. Whereas the right has this very passive, don't tread on me, maybe mindset. But this idea that you don't have to actually do anything because the market will simply take care of it for you. Well, as we've seen, that's one of the many things that has not proven to be true. The market has not taken care of things for us. So if you are in this environment, someone who is very conservative, what should you be doing? One, I wouldn't be betting on a collapse. You might want to be thinking about what happens if there is a collapse. What happens if this does continue? This is the point of Taleb. It's you don't want to invest in a particular trend that you see. I can say, I see this normal trend going, and so I'm going to structure my entire life around things being normal. I want to think about how to structure life in terms of things, with a little bit situation indifferent. Like, what's the way to have maximum resiliency as much as possible? Of course, you can't always do that, but it's different. You don't want to overinvest in a particular trend, even the ones that I'm telling you. But I do think you'd be thinking about like this and say, let's not invest too much in thinking that the fever pitch is going to continue, and do sort of the hard work of organizing, which is, building communities, building strong families and households, strong churches, building the economic structures that are going to provide the base from which to operate and be able to some extent resist a very hostile society that may well be imposed upon you. And I'd also say this is somewhat also preconditional to being prepared in case there is an opportunity for change. If you don't have organizations, if you don't have networks, if you're weak, if you're like that bottom 25% of society that has been kind of wrecked, by the system. And again, don't want to give them a total pass either. There's definitely some things that they need to take into account of their own decisions. But if we end up like that scenario, if that group of people, then it doesn't matter what opportunities are there. We're not going to be able to take advantage of them. So building healthy, strong systems among the like-minded and people who are essentially, to some extent, less than fully dependent on the system is one thing that I would be looking to do. But I would be looking to do that in ways that are not as deliberately provocative or based on an assumption that there's going to be like this great resonance with the continued fever pitch. And, one thing we already see, like the politicians are already reacting. Mitch McConnell is back to business as usual, completely neglecting his own voters because he looks at 2020 and says, MAGA's dead, and now I can do whatever I want again. Now, is that totally true? Maybe he's miscalculating, but that's basically, what they're doing. I think, I'll give you another prediction. I'll give you a prediction. I predict J.D. Vance pivots back to the center. In 2016, he was sort of the Never Trump guy, and he was positioning himself to be the face of the respectable voice of the ignored, suffering masses after Trump lost the election in 2016. The only problem was Trump won the election. So then what happens? He becomes hard MAGA. He dramatically underperformed Mike DeWine, the governor running for re-election. He did okay, but I think we're going to see a guy like J.D. Vance pivot back to the center and tone down some of the rhetoric. I think we're going to see it happen in the politicians. And so I think we need to be thinking about what signals the market are sending us. We can keep testing new things, but my bet. What am I doing? What I'm doing is saying, I'm picking a bet on Sirius that I want to be bold. I want to live not by lies, as I say. I want to be willing to call them like I see them, but I also want to be not predicting calamities, not acting apocalyptic. You've probably heard me a million times. Beware of apocalyptic thinking, and want to be very seriously focused on, okay, how can we build these structures? How can we live in this society? How to be more serious and substantive, less rhetorical and provocative. That's going to be one of my themes. And of course, it's easy for me to say that because that's naturally who I am. I'm not naturally suited to the hardcore red meat. So that's me. Other people are going to be, more oriented towards that. And so maybe they'll keep doing it. I'm not critiquing anybody else. Everybody has to make their own decisions in light of their own skills, their own scenario, and where they are. But I'm sort of thinking that there's certainly a hunger for normal. Although, if history is any guide, something crazy is going to happen this year we're not even thinking about. We have to be ready for that. But I would be leery of thinking that the fever pitch of populism and the Civil War and the national divorce and all that stuff is going to continue at the level that it has been historically. I sense that is probably going to fade a bit, just as most sort of populist things have. So with that, I will leave you there and wish you all a very happy, prosperous 2023.